Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Mastering Rod Building Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Falconer, and I am very excited to have a hardcore, dedicated episode on my current favorite of many favorites of fishing techniques, and that's bait finesse system fishing or BFS fishing. And my guest today is you could hardly pick somebody better to come on and talk to us about this. And so, to that end, my guest is Amir Azzabi. Did I pronounce that correctly? Is it Azzabi?
Perfectly. Yep.
Perfectly. All right. And so Amir is the founder and owner of Bait Finesse Empire, and you can find it real easy. Just Google Bait Finesse Empire or www.baitfinesseempire, which is, as far as I know, it's certainly the first absolutely bait finesse system dedicated tackle shop in North America, maybe in the world. I mean, I've been in a lot of shops in Japan that have this equipment. Tackle Warehouse has it, Hookup Tackle has some, but this is a complete broad scope, dedicated bait finesse only shop in Phoenix, Arizona. And so, Amir is a huge BFS enthusiast, has a very talented team that works with him, not only to test products and kind of stock the right stuff in the shop, but also to create content and educate and bring people to BFS. In the spirit of rod building, he kind of got started in the business, in a lot of ways, assisting with Dobbins rods and helping them kind of set up and design their excellent BFS rods. And so, Amir, welcome to the Mastering Rod Building
Thank
Podcast.
you.
Thanks for joining.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited for this
I'm
conversation.
excited about this one because I'm this has been kind of a transformational thing for me lately, and we'll get into it. But so talk to me. I ask all my guests. There's like compulsory questions. How did you get into fishing in the first place?
How did I get into fishing? Probably like I'd assume the majority of people, right? My dad was an angler. Now he
Okay,
wasn't a hardcore tournament angler. We didn't even own a bass boat or anything like that
sure.
growing up. But he'd take
Me
me to
neither.
the lakes, to the out here in Arizona, the mountain lakes,
Yep.
especially almost, at least a couple times a month. And we'd bring a can of corn and some worms, and we'd catch rainbow trout and largemouth bass and bluegill
Yep.
and whatever we can get. And so I was really kind of instilled with that outdoors and fishing passion as a young kid. As I got older, got into high school, got into other things, it kind of ran away from me. I didn't fish for a while there, and then one point later in life, in my early to mid 20s, I was out camping with my now wife, and she said, "Hey, we passed the Walmart. Why don't you grab a fishing rod and hit this little creek by our campsite?" And I did, and
And you
since that
married her.
day,
Good call.
yeah,
Good call.
absolutely. And since that day, I mean, it's been fishing, 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 man.
Rekindled the passion. Yeah, that's awesome, man.
Absolutely.
Well, what you've done with the shop is just amazing. And so if you'll indulge me for a second, I'll give you my little rant and background, right? So one of the things that I really, really love about custom rod building and enthusiast tackle and things like that is you can get as serious or go as far down the rabbit hole as you want to or not, right? And I married, was fortunate enough to marry a woman who also supported being outdoors and whose dad was a big duck hunter and a big fisherman. And so may he rest in peace, my father-in-law, Dr. Henry Udodge, we used to fish a lot, and we fished on Lake Washita in Arkansas, and it's a very deep water, very clear water lake, and it's a mix of largemouth and spotted bass. And he was one of these cats that he would rather catch five fish on a top water than fill the boat, throwing a Carolina rig or a
Hmm.
crankbait or, something like that. He just wanted top water. And so somewhat reluctantly, we got to where we were focusing on topwater year round. And there was a time in the spring and the summer and the fall when the shad were just tiny, right? And the spotted bass were all over them. But um, if you threw too large a lure, if you weren't completely accurate, like right on the spot, like when a fish broke, you needed to hit it like the center of the bullseye, or you weren't going to catch him, right? And he came he came home one day from having gone to a boat show and he had this is the first time I'd ever seen Lucky Craft lures. And he had some, JDM tackle is prevalent now. You have a ton of
Yeah.
it, right? High end stuff, very effective, incredible finishes, high quality hooks and hardware, But back then it was, I'd never seen this stuff. And it's like, you paid $20 for a top water. And he had a box of these things, but he had these little Sammy 65s and American
Oh yeah.
shad. And dude, we lit them up on that lure, but we couldn't throw them. right? So we started this process of me building these ultralight bait casting rods. This is
Mm.
25 years ago. And then we got these JDM large arbor spool reels. It was like the Shimano Scorpion MG 1000s back then. And we super tuned them and we swapped the bearings and we did all this. And we got to where we could, throw these baits a good distance accurately. And we just really had great success. And then when he got older and we didn't fish out there as much anymore, I kind of got away from it. And then all of a sudden BFS happens. It was like, oh my gosh, we were talking offline before we started and you said, a technique doesn't exist until you name it, right? It's like I didn't realize I was doing something like the heavier end of BFS back then, trying to solve the same problem BFS solves, right? And you mentioned growing up fishing for trout and panfish. There's something about ultralight. Like I just like fish on light tackle. It's just way more fun. Um, and this technique is very effective. So I guess if you don't mind, if you'll indulge us, because I know you're an expert, you have this conversation with people all the time. But for the benefit of me and our audience, talk to me about the origins of BFS and where did this come from and why BFS and how did this all get started?
All right. Well, I mean, that conversation is a deep one, and there's a lot of different moving parts to it. And it goes back
Sure.
as far as fishing goes back, as far as I'm concerned. At some point in time, probably I don't have the exact date, but probably in the early 1900s, right? Someone invented the first, at least semi-modern fishing reel.
Right. Revolving
What do they
spool
call
reel. Yeah.
multiplier reels,
Yeah.
right?
Multiplier. Right.
And
Exactly.
they took them to a shop and they started selling them. And probably within a week of selling that thing, one of those customers said, "I wonder how light I could
Yeah.
throw." And
Right.
that right there is really the origins of what we're talking about today, right?
Yep. Yep.
That ingenuity of just wanting to push the boundaries of that equipment that you have and do something different with it.
Yeah.
And so really like where does the foothold start? Where does this start becoming commercially viable? Where does it start becoming more prevalent? Well, it all really centers around Japan, like a lot of things in the fishing industry does.
Yep.
And that's just the nature of having a, a small island, highly pressured fisheries, a lot of nice, beautiful fisheries, right?
Right.
But high population,
Yep.
small amount of waters,
Crushing
very
fishing pressure. Right.
very
Yeah.
highly pressured fish, whether you're
Yeah.
talking about the largemouth bass
Right.
or the the native Yamame trout or
Right.
Awana trouts or whatever, right?
Right.
They've all been pressured for thousands of years over there,
Yeah.
and
Right.
so there's amount of ingenuity that comes out of Japan, whether it be on the small side or the big side or even everything
Sure.
in between, in order to
Yep.
catch these fish is huge.
Yep.
Um, at one point or another, and really like to throw another country in there, Sweden, you've got the old Abus, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of a big start of what we now call bait finesse as well.
Okay.
I want to say it was in the late 70s, maybe early 80s. I don't have the exact dates on this, but they really
Yeah.
they started pushing those ambassador reels and they started
Mm-hmm.
making them smaller and smaller. And they didn't
Right.
really sell those, I don't think, in the US very much, but that was
Right.
something you can find in Europe and something that really took off in Japan. And so
Right.
Abu had a whole JDM market, right? Where
Still
they're
do. They still do. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. They absolutely still do. They have a whole subset of different products that they sell and make for Japan. And as part of that, you have the old Abu Ambassador reels, and you have the
Mm-hmm.
1500 and the 2500 size,
Mm-hmm.
right? The two smaller sizes.
Right.
Uh, Now, those are really popular with trout fishermen. Out of the box, even in the 70s and 80s, those were not necessarily going to cast the smallest lures out there. And if you're really looking to cast the smallest stuff, you were probably still off going with a spinning reel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just
Yeah.
by nature of physics and the design of a spinning reel, that line's going to come off much easier. You're going to be able to cast lighter stuff. But
Right.
the amount of ingenuity and the advantages of having a bait casting reel all play into it, where people wanted to push those small ambassador reels and some other more boutique Japanese brands that started creating similar small round body reels, right?
Right.
Suzuki being one of them.
Right.
They started pushing a lot of aftermarket parts for these things.
Mm-hmm.
Companies started coming out with spools that you could drop in, better bearings, level wines, whatever, right? Changing
Right.
all these little parts, changing the handle, changing even just cosmetic parts, right? To really fit this
Right.
role in this niche of having this idea of having this small aggressive, fast-paced fishing reel that you could use with
Right.
short rods to really tackle um, the native trout in the Japanese streams.
Yeah, and to be clear, just to give people a perspective, like I'm 52. I've been throwing a bait caster since I was probably 9 or 10 years old. There was a time when anything less than a quarter of an ounce was hard to throw on a bait caster, right? And they all had level lines that moved as line was feeding out, all these different things. Now there's a lot of good bait casters that if you spool them right or do whatever, replace a spool, that are still not considered BFS. You can throw 367 ounce, even less. But when we start talking about true BFS, we're talking about some cases people throwing lures down to under 2 grams, right? And so like 64th of an ounce and being able to do so effectively and then fish effectively. So I'm throwing that out there just to get your head around this. So it's what Amir's talking about is more than just light bait casting. This is truly ultra light,
It,
highly tuned, specialized. It
I'll
can be.
say
It
that
can
came
be. Right.
later. I'll say actually
Yeah.
that came much later though, right? When we're
Yeah.
talking about the origins of what has now become bait finesse, and you're really talking about those, like I said, those ambassador reels in the late
Yeah.
70s, early mid 80s, even into the 90s, right? In Japan. Really what you're throwing, and I line my desk here with a lot of lures to
Oh
show
yeah.
you,
Here we go.
is stuff like this,
Oh
right?
yeah.
This is now a lot of people might call this a jerk bait, but I don't. It's not. This is a trout minnow, right?
Right.
It's a fairly flat bodied, fast sinking trout minnow.
Is
This
that
one
a
I don't know.
Smith or a Jackson?
This
What
is
is
a
it?
Timco.
TMCO. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, Timco. This particular one weighs probably 3 to 4 grams, somewhere in that range.
Hmm.
I forget off the top of my head. So we're talking over an eighth of an ounce.
Okay.
Right. So we're not talking like that real tiny stuff yet. But this is like a very effective size and weight for fishing for trout in streams in Japan, in the US, in Europe, all over the world, right? So
Right.
really this is the kind of stuff. And here's just another example of a, different, hook stuck in my finger, super sharp.
Yeah, they are sharp.
This
Oh,
one's a
beautiful.
mukai, but it's similar. It's a trout minnow, right? It's a very flat body, fast sinking. And what they're for is for cutting through currents, and they're going to weigh in that 3 to 5 gram range. And I'm saying grams, and I know you threw grams out there too.
Mhm.
In the bait finesse world, we use grams. It's just more accurate, and it's such a global sport that everything you're buying, whether it be from Europe or Japan, is listed in grams. All the rods have grams listed on them, so on and so forth, right? So that's
Same
what
with
I'm.
slow pitch. Yeah, same with slow pitch jigging. I
Okay,
think
cool.
most of the techniques that originated abroad, right? Yeah. And so to give people just a baseline to kind of a place where their feet can touch bottom, an eighth of an ounce is about what, 5 grams?
No,
Oh,
3.5.
3.5 grams. Okay, yeah. So to give you a sense, 3.5 grams, about an eighth of an ounce. So that gives you a sense,
And
right?
then
So
so your
7 grams would be a
seven
quarter of an
gram is your
ounce.
quarter,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that's if you keep those two numbers in head, the 3.5 and the 7, you can kind of ballpark where the rest of it fits. And those are
Right.
important numbers because those are kind of you got your middle ground and what a lot of people consider the higher end of BFS, right? That 7, 8, 9 gram range is what now
Heavier
a
end.
lot of
Yeah.
people nowadays consider the heavier, higher end of BFS,
Hmm.
right?
Okay. Yep.
Anyway, so you had this, like I said earlier, there's a lot of moving parts, right? So you had this subculture of aggressive, fast trout fishing, really focused around trout mainly, developing in Japan, using those ambassador and similar type reels, using a lot of short rods developed by a lot of custom companies over there, a lot of high-end glass companies, and that you had a
Right.
mixture of graphite rods and fiberglass rods, just depending
Yep.
on techniques and waters and species you're going after.
Hmm.
And then really where as big as that is, and as much as we look back on that era of bait finesse fishing now with a lot of nostalgia, we see those videos and we love those round reels
Right.
and stuff. It was
Right.
even then in Japan, it's such a niche, right? It's such a
Right.
small niche. It's not like it was a big commercially viable thing.
Right.
When did this technique or set of techniques or system, even we want to call it, right? When did
Yep.
it actually start coming to the forefront? Well, it happened over the course of probably about a decade and a half, actually, is how long it took to get there. In the early 2000s, you had Daiwa
Hmm.
step up the game in the smaller, finessier side of bait casting with the Pixie series of
Hmm.
reels.
I
You may be
remember them
familiar
well.
with those.
Yeah.
They were
Oh yeah.
huge for the longest times. Now, those were, I want to say like 50, maybe 70 class reels, right?
Yeah.
Like
I
the
remember
actual
they were
body.
500 plus bucks and they came in cool colors and you couldn't get one. You couldn't
Yeah,
touch one. Yeah.
yeah,
That's what I
absolutely.
remember about them. Yeah.
And that's what a lot of people remember when they think about bait finesse now, right? That now it's kind of re-emerging and more people are learning about it. And people go, oh, this thing was so expensive back in the day.
Hmm.
And it was. And it
Yeah.
was.
But
But
it's
there's
a specialist enthusiast product, right? Yeah. And the
exactly.
Pioneer always spends a
And
lot on R&D.
a lot of those products were built at the absolute premium specs, right? Because they're
Right.
not
Yeah.
making them for mass market, they're making them for a niche market that is willing
Right.
to invest in that particular system of fishing, right?
Right.
Um,
Absolutely.
so you had Daiwa come out with those Pixie series reels in the early 2000s, and then by the end of the 2000s, mid to end, like 2007, 2008, is when it really started to take hold in the Japan bass tournament scene, right?
Yeah.
The big, their version of the pros, their version of the
Right.
MLF or whatever, right? Like the
Right.
Japan bass scene. And really, who I attribute to making Bait Finesse what it is today, and what really made it as commercially viable as it is right now, and as global as it is right now, really comes down to one man, in my opinion, over in Japan by the name of Yukihiro Sawamura. Now, Yukihiro
Yukihiro
Sawamura
Saramura.
is a Japanese pro fisherman.
Okay.
Great record over there, lots of wins. Does a lot, obviously, of bait finesse. But even more important for the particular sport of Bait Finesse, who he is he's the president of KTF, Kirill
Mm.
Tuning Factory. Now,
Okay.
Kirill Tuning Factory is like the premier, the absolute highest end in the Bait Finesse world, anyways,
Okay.
Japanese aftermarket reel parts.
Okay.
And
So bearings,
he
spools,
bearing
handles, all that. Yeah.
spools, handles,
Yeah.
really the spools is what they're known for, right?
Okay.
And Mr. Sawamura-san, being a pro fisherman, getting a hold of these Pixie reels, as well as JDM Abus. They had moved past the ambassadors at that point. They were getting into the Revo LTXs, some of the smaller
Right.
Revo type
Low
reels.
profile reels. Yeah.
Exactly. He really started playing around with those smaller JDM reels, low profile bass reels,
Mm.
and kicking it up a big notch, right? By tuning those spoon, not even tuning, but making all new spools for them, right? He owns a factory that essentially creates these things, right?
Right.
So through
Right.
his own design processes, he created spools for the old Pixies, for the old Abu LT, Revo LTX reels, etc. And he started playing with those, and he developed what became known as the Bait Finesse. He created the name Bait Finesse. Before that,
Yeah.
it hadn't been named,
Okay.
and
So
he
he's the
took
guy.
it.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
he took it to the tournament scene, and he won tournaments. If
Yeah.
not
The
top,
rest is history,
if not
literally.
number one, then he was number two or whatever. And this guy had a loadout of 5 bait finesse rods and reels on his deck or whatever. Like that is
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
exclusively how he was fishing. And why was
Right.
he fishing like that? Well, because the tournament scene in Japan is so highly pressured, so highly pressured. And really what was winning tournaments at that time were, I mean, same things that win tournaments here, honestly, right? You got your drop shots, you got your Ned rays, you got your finesse flipping jigs, you got all that, right? But the
Yep.
thing is, over in Japan, they are so much like you can't explain how much more pressured, at least they claim they are than us,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That they take those techniques that we're doing here on 12-pound line or whatever, and they want to move it to 4-pound line. They want to move it to 6-pound line to have a smaller presentation, a more compact presentation, a finessier presentation, right?
Right.
Um, to
You
combat
know,
lion
it's
shy fish
it's
even.
so shocking because in my experience personally, and I have the great fortune of getting to go to Japan a couple of times a year, and it's business, it's work, representing Fuji. Um, the influence of Japanese tackle on our largest market, which is the competitive bass fishing scene, it can't be overstated. It's been
Mm-hmm.
transformational, right? And that's not to say there's not great lures and ideas and things that come from the States. There are,
Absolutely
but
there
the
is.
the thing that shocks you when you go to Japan, and I haven't fished Lake Biwa, but I've been to Lake Biwa and I've been around. The scene in Japan is tiny compared to our bass fishing scene. And so it's just so remarkable that so much innovation and advancement is driven out of a relatively small, hyper focused, hyper competitive community. You know what I mean? There's not even that many lakes in Japan that have bass. And oh, by the
Exactly.
way, the majority of people in Japan consider them an invasive species and don't like them. And it's very controversial in
It
some
is.
parts of the country to bass fish. It's like it blows my mind. And it's
A
not the
lot of
impression.
Japanese companies are moving away from
Yeah,
bass.
yeah, and it's not because they're pressured away from it. That's not the impression you would get over here. Like I would be like, oh man, everybody in Japan must bass fish. Look at the way these guys are spinning off and gals, new tackle and new techniques and new hooks and rigs and all
Mm-hmm.
this. And it's shocking when you see how small it
But
actually
but
is.
really, it's the opposite, right? Because if it was so prevalent that everyone was doing it and the fish were everywhere and they were plentiful and it was easy,
Probably
you
wouldn't
wouldn't
drive the
you wouldn't need
innovation.
You
Yeah.
wouldn't need that
Right.
innovation, right? But
Right.
because like you said, the waters are so select. There's only X
Yeah.
amount of lakes in Japan that even have this invasive North American fish, right?
Right.
Even though they have some of the biggest examples of that fish in the world, nonetheless,
Right.
it's very select what
Yeah.
lakes have them. Those
Yeah.
lakes are usually reservoirs that are kind of
Yeah.
like our Western lakes here, right? Mountain reservoirs, highly
Yeah.
clear,
Yeah.
highly pressured. Not a,
Yeah.
it's not the biggest fishing scene in Japan, bass, but it is highly pressured and it does have a big
Yeah.
tournament scene. And so
Yeah.
those fish are just so much more cautious.
Yeah.
And so to swing that back into the story, right? Mr. Sawamura over in Japan in that 2007, 2008 period really started, using his Kirill tuning factory, his KTF company to tune these reels to be able to fish those more specialized, smaller, more compact baits on lighter lines
Mhm.
without having to use a spinning reel. Now, why
Right.
would you not want to do that on a spinning reel?
You just took the words out of my mouth.
Well, first of all, there's the easy one, personal preference. Some
Sure.
people don't like spinning reels. Some people don't like bait casting reels.
Right.
At the end of the day, they're all just tools.
Yeah.
You should use what you're comfortable with. Use what
Right.
works best for you. But that being said, physics is physics, and you can say my opinion is this or that. But at the end of the day, there are certain things bait casters are better at, and certain things spinning reels are better at, and
Yeah.
it's just by nature of the design of the product. Now, bait casters, and this is really why you started to see it used in that Japan tournament scene. They're going to be better at a few things. One, that's the accuracy,
Mhm.
right? The way the line comes off the reel is a straight shot, right? You're not making it take a 90-degree angle and then
Right.
spiraling it off the reel. It's
Right.
a
Right.
straight shot, right?
Yeah.
So just by nature of the way that line comes off the reel, it's more accurate casting if you know what you're doing with the reels. Um, it has more torque,
Yep.
right? It's a winch. A bait caster is a winch.
Right.
A spinning
And
reel is a.
less, yeah,
Go
less
ahead.
twist too. Yeah, less
Exactly.
twist. Yeah.
A spinning
On
reel is a.
light drag settings with light lines with light hooks, right? And it's easy to me, it's easier. These reels like that I got from you for BFS, the drag is incredibly smooth at the settings you would fish it, right?
Yep.
And that's these settings can be so light. Not all spinning reels do well in those drag settings, right?
Yep. And then so you've got the accuracy, you've got the torque and the winch, and like you said, that plays into the less line twists, right? Because
Mhm.
you can go buy $1,000 Vanquish, right? The highest end spinning reel that exists on the market ever made. And every time you spin that, it's twisting your
One
line.
twist.
You can
That's
buy
right.
a
Yeah.
$10 spinning reel. Every time you twist it,
Yep.
it's spinning
Yep.
your
Yep.
line, right?
Yep.
It's just the
Yeah.
it's just the design. It's the design, right?
Right.
There's obviously ways you can overcome line twist and this and that, but at the end of the day, if you can get rid of it, it's a good thing to be able to get rid of
Absolutely.
line twist. And then
Yeah.
on top of that, and probably most importantly, maybe not most important, I don't know, it's going to depend, but for me, what I really like about a bait finesse reel versus a spinning reel is cast, reel, cast,
Yeah. Not a
reel.
lot of other steps in
You're
between.
not
Right.
setting your line, setting it, casting, holding, you don't
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
that.
Now is
Cast.
that I'm looking, he's holding up this low profile. Is it an arc gravity? Is that
That is exactly what this
okay?
is.
All right. I think I have one on the way.
It's a very good reel. It's a very
Well,
good
it's
reel.
I was scared of it because of how reasonably it's priced relative to some other reels. I was like, it can't be that good if it's, but I kept reading
No,
your
it is
reviews
that
and
good.
yeah, well, the awesome,
It is that good.
awesome.
It
No
really is. It really is.
excuses. Yeah.
So anyways, because of those reasons I just said, right?
Yeah.
That the tournament anglers, really pushed by Mr. Sawamura, started to bring that technique into the tournament market. And once you start doing that, people start paying attention. And that's when more people, more companies, et cetera, started piling on. Now, he really pushed this in 2007, I think, is when he really began like experimenting with it. In
Mhm.
2008, he teamed up with mm, probably one of my favorite Japanese companies, and that's Timco.
Yeah.
Uh, I believe he was a sponsored angler for them at the time, right?
Okay.
Now,
Uh-huh.
without going too much into the politics of marketing and global markets,
Sure.
Timco owns and operates in Japan a company called Fenwick.
Hmm.
They are not the Fenwick that you buy here in the USA. They
Right.
were prior to the corporate corporatization of Fenwick and going into the pure fishing umbrella of
Right.
brands, right?
Right.
But
Right.
Fenwick, prior to that, obviously has a long history of being one of the top rod companies in the USA and in the world. Now,
Huge
Timco,
innovator. Yeah. Yeah.
huge innovators. And Timco is in a lot of ways more than just the spiritual successor to that. They
Mhm.
are that torch carried forward in Japan's market, right? They had so basically how that happened is Timco, being one of the kind of legendary Japanese fishing brands of their own that have been around for going on 80 years at this point, right? In the 70s, they got rights to distribute Fenwick, American Fenwick, in Japan, and they did that. And then when Fenwick was folded into the Pure Fishing Corporation, Timco somehow, through some lawyering, I'm sure, were able to keep the Fenwick branding for themselves in Japan. And so they carry on, they continue to build Fenwick branded rods, but really they're built and controlled by Timco, right?
Okay.
Now, the reason I say that is because the first Bait Finesse rod that came out, and really like the first marketable Bait Finesse rod that said Bait Finesse for it, there's advertised as this is for bass bait finesse fishing, was
Yep.
a Fenwick model GWT64L plus P. So,
Well done, sir. Well done.
so from
That's a
that,
mouthful.
from that, GWT is just Goldwing, right? That's the name of the model or whatever. 64L P plus 6'4",
Okay.
6'4", L light power, P power plus. So it was a light
Okay.
power plus. That was the
Okay.
rating of the rod. It was rated to cast, I believe, 1/8 to 3/8, and rated for
Okay.
5 to 12 pound line.
Okay.
Okay. Those are the stats that I wanted to throw out there because people love to say, oh, Bait Finesse is only this ultra tiny stuff. Bait Finesse is only ultralight. Bait Finesse is only trout fishing. Bait
Right.
Finesse is only bass. No, like the first
All these things.
marketable
Yeah.
real Bait Finesse rod that said Bait Finesse on it by the guy that is known in Japan as the father of Bait Finesse, 6'4" light plus power. So a little bit,
There you go.
kind of between your light and medium light is where that
Yeah.
rod landed. Now, what did he use that rod for? Why would he develop that rod? This is pretty much exactly the kind of thing you would throw on that rod, right? We have in the US what we call finesse jigs. And
Yeah.
in the US, you have a 1/4 ounce, a 3/8 ounce finesse jig. You throw a 3 inch
Right.
craw, you call that finesse.
Right.
This is about, I think it's a 1/16 ounce head,
Yeah.
right? And you'd probably put like a 2.5 inch little craw, swim bait, whatever, something like that on there.
Right.
And so your whole
Right.
presentation, your head, your skirt, your plastic, because that's what you're throwing. You're not just
Downsized.
throwing the
So
head,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But your whole
Right.
presentation is probably weighing about 1/8 of an ounce,
Hmm.
maybe in the 5 gram range, which would be like what, 3/16 of an ounce, right?
Hmm.
So that's the kind of thing. And here's just another example with a trailer on it, right?
Yeah.
And
And
that's
I
the
know
kind of
you all
change
can't
you're
see all
throwing.
this while we're talking on the podcast, but we're going to put it up on YouTube and you can come
Oh
take a
yeah,
look.
yeah. Sorry,
Stuff looks great.
yeah, I'll kind
No,
of
you're
talk that out
fine.
more. And you got your worms, right?
Yeah.
It's a Timco worm, like a
Yeah.
6 inch worm. I think the worm weighs about 3 grams, so a little bit under 1/8 ounce when you weigh the actual worm. I was throwing this worm the other day. You can see a little tiny hook on it right there.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was throwing this on a split shot rig, right? Something that
Hmm.
highly underutilized. We've all done it when we were kids, and no one does it anymore for some reason. But man, you can
Right.
catch a lot of fish on a split shot, big bass, small bass,
Yeah.
trout, whatever, right? So,
Yeah.
um, and I was throwing that with about I want to say like a 16th ounce split shot, right?
Hmm.
So again, that puts me in the range of throwing stuff that's in the 3 to 5, 6, up to 7 gram range. So most of my bass lures that I'm throwing, even though it might say, oh, I'm throwing a 16th ounce jig, really at the end of the day, what you're actually throwing is somewhere between 1/8 to a 1/4 ounce when you
All in.
it
Right.
all
Yeah.
up and add it all up, right? And so
Yeah.
that's what those Bait Finesse rods at that time period were really good at. And the reason you'd want to do it on those rods is because you're casting again to highly pressured bass, so you want to use light line. You got all the advantage we already talked about. Bait casting reel has over a spinning reel in those situations, but you
Hmm.
also have the management of fluoro line. Bait
Hmm.
casters handle fluoro line, especially when you get down to those smaller sizes,
It's different,
a
better
lot
than spinners. Yeah.
a lot better than spinning reel, right?
Yeah.
So you're
Yeah.
throwing those little lures I just described and showed to you, and you're throwing them not necessarily in the reeds, but on the very edge of the reeds, right? And that's not
Right.
necessarily like over that log, but on the edge of that log, on the edge of that overhang, and you're getting that big bass to come out and bite it, and you're using a light line and a light lure, and you need a rod that's going to be able to be delicate enough to handle that light stuff, but move that fish away from that cover as soon as it
Yeah.
jolts out and takes your bait.
Yeah. Which is where the torque comes into play, right? Yeah. So,
The torque of the reel and the way
yeah,
the rods are built
yeah,
absolutely are made to do just that. Pull them away from the cover so they can't get, but you coax them out and then you pull them away basically,
right.
right?
Yeah.
As
Well,
opposed to a flipping stick where you're just pulling them, you're in the reeds. This is on the edge of kind of
right.
situation.
I've been using Timco hooks for fly tying for 30 years, 25 years, something like that. And I really wasn't that aware that they made these baits. And the one, since we're talking about Timco baits we love, the one that I am just such a fan of and I got from your shop is the red pepper micro.
Oh my gosh,
This
that
is a
thing is
tiny
so good.
little, 45 millimeters, so under 2 inches, 1.8 something inch, about a 14th of an ounce bait. And I'll tell this story. So I'm an enthusiast. I like having a challenge. I like building rods around a new thing. So I would have gotten excited about this BFS thing anyway. And in my mind, I traditionally think about this as being trout fishing technique with maybe some bass, bluegill, farm pond kind of stuff, right? Never entered my mind that I would entertain it in saltwater. So, long story short, where I live in Orange Beach, when I'm working, I am on a saltwater canal, a brackish water canal,
Okay.
and people have fish lights out, including me. And what I do a lot of times, Amir, is just tape guides on a rod and go out there and test cast it, right? Or spool two reels that are the same, one with braid and a leader, and one with fluoro or fluoro versus mono, and just go cast them and see what they'll do, right? See how they perform. Oh my gosh. I literally was not fishing thinking that I was going to catch fish. I was really just testing gear, and the pool I can throw in is too small, so I'm throwing it in the water. And when I say to you that every time I'm down there, which is at least half of the year, I'm probably walking out on the dock and throwing a few casts every morning and every
Mm-hmm.
night.
Yep.
If that's all I do, that's what I do. And then sometimes I'm taking a kayak out, sometimes I'm taking a boat out, I'm fishing. So I had been fishing this place for more than a year, regularly, daily. And the day that I started using the BFS gear and ultimately going down to 4 pound leader mono or fluoro, right? Or straight or as a leader on a reel spooled with braid, it was like I was fishing a different fishery. The number and size of species that you catch, it literally blew my mind. I sort of intellectually get it as a fly fisherman that you sometimes downsize to get a bite and all this kind of stuff, but it wasn't just these fish that we were catching that we're catching more of, like redfish and flounder and trout. But there's these fish that are very difficult to catch on bait. I'm sorry, on lures like mangrove snapper and these ribbon fish and these things that I'm lighting up on this tiny little bait finesse gear. And oh, by the way, if I was fishing my normal gear and I caught a 12-inch redfish, I'd horse it right in, fling it on the dock, unhook it, throw it. Well, now that's a really fun fish to catch on this gear, right? So, um, my mind's kind of blown, and I'm kind of glad I did it the way I did it. And like I said, I wasn't really trying to fish. I wasn't putting a lot of attention to the lure I was using or the color selection or anything else, but it's like everything I throw works and it's so fun, right? And so it's just been a real, now I'm really paying attention and it's like, okay, what else do I need to be trying? I see you wearing your Jackson Lures hat.
Yeah.
Got a bunch of Jackson lures. I've been trying to get some Smith lures and D contacts and stuff. You guys, they sell really well for you. And so you kind of have to grab what you can get when you get. But all that is to say, this stuff works. And it's not just, you don't need to be like some ultralight nerd to want to go do this. I would challenge you, go to the place you fish most often and have never bait finesse
100%.
fished and try it. And you will be surprised. It will not be like any other day you've ever been on that water. I'm talking about bodies of water you know well, and you would say you have dialed in. It's shocking how many bites you get with this stuff. And now again, I've also gotten my butt kicked. If I have I'm fishing around a bunch of pilings with barnacles and boat docks. And
Mm-hmm.
if I hook a 24-inch redfish, I ain't
It's
stopping
taking
it,
it. Yeah.
right?
No,
But
absolutely.
I'm willing
Absolutely.
to take that risk for getting 4 or 5 times as many bites. It just, and
Yeah.
it, if you, I wish people would just try it. Just try it once. Build one rod, buy one reel, buy one rod, whatever. Just buy a handful of lures and just try it because it's shocking how effective it is.
It it's such a versatile and fun way to fish, right? And now here's the thing, though. At the end of the day, I mean, there's you do all the same lures on a spinning rod, right? So I don't want to discourage anyone and say, hey, if you go out there with a spinning rod, you're not going to have fun. You're not going to catch those fish. That's absolutely not true, right? You can do
Right.
the same stuff. It's a matter of personal preference. It's a matter of what
Sure.
advantages you want out of your equipment. You know, we,
Yeah.
we talked about what a bait caster does better. We didn't talk about what a spinning reel does better. And there's a lot of things a spinning reel does better.
Well, yeah, well, let's talk about that. Yeah.
One being line capacity. That's
Yeah.
the first thing, right? Like
Right. Right.
you can hold 300 yards of 2 pound, 4 pound, 6 pound line on a spinning reel if you wanted. You're never going to do that on a bait caster and be able to actually cast those
Yeah,
things.
and part of what he's referring to is, and this will make sense. We'll unpack it a little bit, but most of
We'll get into it.
these
Yeah.
reels, super tuned to throw this ultralight stuff, have a maximally large arbor, and you actually don't have a lot of line on the reel, and that's on
Correct.
purpose
That
because
is
if
on
you put
purpose.
too much line on the reel, it creates too much mass, which is too much startup inertia, and it really inhibits the performance of the reel. So a lot of these, really going down to having like 50, 65, 75 yards a line, in some cases less, depending on what you're using on one of these high-end dedicated BFS reels, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
But it
mean,
makes a difference. I overfilled some of mine in the beginning before I
it's a
read the
mess.
instruction manual. It
Yeah,
kills them. You can't
it
throw them
does.
without bait casting them. Then I finally pull off enough line. I'm sorry, without backlashing them.
Yep,
Then I finally pull off enough line because I've gnarled it all up, backlashing it so many times, and all of a sudden the reel runs like a top. And it's like, oh, this is why
absolutely.
they say don't fill it past this much.
Yeah, one thing I'll point out, and I do want to get back to kind of the history of story we're going there, but
Sorry,
one thing,
yeah,
no, but one thing I'll throw out there because you got on it. So if you look at any Daiwa bait finesse reel, right?
mhm,
Doesn't matter whether and the reels are really like subcategorized, you could say, into your kind of medium light, light, and ultra light. There's a whole
mhm,
niche, and it depends on the size of the body, the size of the spool, all so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, what I'm getting to is if you look at any of those on the box, Iowa says put 45 meters, which is about 50 yards.
yeah,
So it doesn't matter if you're rocking a 32 millimeter spool or a 28 millimeter spool.
yeah.
The pros are telling you put 50 yards of line on this
Don't
thing.
overload it. Yeah,
Oh, exactly. And
yeah.
and really when you want to start getting into that ultralight stuff, right? That really like that sub 2 gram, sub 1.5 gram stuff that, like under 1/16 ounce for those that are not, the gram guys. You start putting less, right? You might put 25 yards, you might put 30 yards. And the reason for that is like you said, it's the mass, it's the weight of the spool determines how well that spool is going to be able to cast the weight of the lure, right?
Yep. Yep.
Um, so, anyways, where was I with the story? All right. So
I'm
in
sorry.
Japan,
Yeah.
no, you're good. You're good. I love it. Japan, 2008, 2007, 9, that era and that era of bass fishing, you really started to have bait finesse taken off, right? It started
Mhm.
catching on. It was really pushed and led by, like I said, Mr. Sawamura, KTF as the real side of things, right?
Yeah.
Using aftermarket parts on mainly Daiwa and Abu reels at that time,
Hmm.
and Timco Fenwick with the rod side of things, right?
Yep.
And they started to push these things to actual mass market, started making them available first through like special order, through KTF shop, and then it started to really catch on where Jackson got into it, Megabass got into it, Shimano got into it. By 2012, that was it. Like in that 3-4 year period after he introduced it to the tournament scene in Japan and named
Blew up.
it, right?
Yeah.
Named it Bait Finesse. And another thing about the name, and we'll get to BFS in a moment. That comes actually later in the story. But another thing about the
Okay.
name is, yeah, he called it Bait Finesse. In the early days, it kind of went by before the BFS acronym came around. People called it Bait Finesse Approach, Bait
Bait
finesse
finesse approach.
style,
Okay.
bait
Okay.
finesse technique. One I really like, I personally sometimes still like to call this bait finesse concept, right?
Hmm.
Daiwa uses that a lot, even still
Hmm.
to this day. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of um, different people feeding into what it should be called, but it all revolved around bait finesse,
Yeah.
which is bait casting finesse, right?
Hmm.
And I think we could take even a moment to define finesse, right? Because we
Hmm.
think about finesse. What is finesse? Finesse basically means with subtlety.
Yep.
That's what finesse dictionary definition of finesse, right? Doing something
Yep.
with subtlety. So you could throw a 3 ounce swim bait, a 12, 13, 15-inch swim bait, whatever, and you could fish it finesse. You absolutely can fish it, and you can finesse those fish out of their hiding spots and catch them, right? But in the
Hmm.
context of what we're talking about today, what finesse means is small.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean with subtlety. You can power
Okay.
fish power
Yep.
fish, meaning like cranking and spinner baiting and top water, aggressive, fast fishing with bait finesse, right? And that may not necessarily be finesse fishing, but in this context, finesse simply means using small stuff. Stuff that basically back in the day was relegated to spinning rods, which people would call finesse rods back,
Right. Yep.
right?
Limp sticks, finesse rods, egg
Dirty
beaters.
wands, whatever, right? So that throws some definitions in there. And then we had Shimano really enter the market in 2012 with the Aldebaran BFS.
Yep.
Okay. Now that was, maybe don't quote me on this, but I want to say that was the first official bait finesse reel.
Okay.
Now there was Pixies before it. There was finesse reels, but this
Right.
was really your first next level, right? This
Yeah.
is the reel that took the concepts that Mr. Saramura with KTF developed and put it into an actual reel that anyone could in Japan could go buy at, their local tackle
The
shop.
tackle shop. Yeah. Right.
And that was the Aldebaran BFS. And
Yep.
Shimano created the term, the acronym BFS, which stands for Bait Finesse System. Now, that term actually came about in 2011. The first piece of official equipment that came out with BFS on it was 2012 with that reel. And in Shimano's mind, and kind of what has since followed, I think most BFS people like myself would define it as, it's a system of fishing, right? It's not only a reel, even though I would say that is probably the primary or the necessity, right? You
Yep.
cannot BFS fish without a BFS reel. It just, or a real tune to be able to do it at least, right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
but Shimano also introduced rods, right, specifically
Hmm.
for that style of fishing. Now, when they say BFS and when Japan says BFS, it still very much means the bass tournament market. You
Okay.
don't see trout rods labeled as BFS. You
Okay.
don't see saltwater rods or panfish rods labeled as BFS. They might be ultralight. You might be able to throw a BFS reel on them and go for it, and they absolutely
Right.
perfectly together. But the term bait finesse system is a system for tournament fishing bass, essentially, right? And it's that rod, it's the reel, it's your line, and it's your presentation at the end of the line. That's what makes it a
Okay.
system. All those things have to be in check. They have to work together as a system in order for you
Right.
to effectively fish this style of fishing. I hate to
Right.
call it a technique because it's not one technique, right? It's a style of fishing different techniques,
Sure.
if that makes
Sure.
sense.
No, it
So,
does. It makes perfect sense. Yeah.
all right. So, anyways, Shimano came out with the BFS reel, the first official like real deal on the market. You can go to shop and buy it, BFS reel in Japan in 2012. Um, Being that it started hitting kind of that mass market, that's when it started catching on globally. Right.
Okay.
And really, like the next place you see catch on, not the US. People have been fishing it in the US way before, right? There's all uber nerds, like, nerdier than me, that know all this stuff, and they were watching the whole thing develop, from the ground level up. But
Right.
really,
Right.
like where you see the next big market push of the style of fishing is in Southeast Asia
Yeah.
and China, right?
Okay.
So it leaves Japan and it kind of starts hitting China and hits Malaysia, hits Singapore and those kinds of places. And it's so huge there, bigger than it is in the US, bigger than it maybe even is in Japan at this point in time. That style of fishing is just so cool over there. They fish
Yeah.
a lot of creeks, a lot of rivers, and they're fishing for like aggressive fish, jungle fish. Right,
Yep.
like I don't know
Yep.
the names of these species, but they're aggressive and it's a fast style of fishing, and
Yeah.
they're also as pressured as some of those fish in Japan are, right? So the technique
Oh
lended it
yeah.
well.
All of them. Right.
And then really once you started seeing these Chinese companies catch on to the trend and essentially learn from Japan how it works, right? These geniuses in Japan came up with the way the reels work and so on and so forth. China saw that and made it a global thing at that point, right? They really
Right.
they obviously made it more affordable, but they really started pushing what is, I think, really helped it take off before it hit mass market in the US was that super ultralight stuff that
Yeah.
you didn't really see in Japan at that time. But those
Mhm.
Chinese reels and Chinese rods really started going lighter and lighter and lighter. Where in Japan, you might be throwing, like I said, an eighth, a 3/16, up to a quarter ounce, even up to 3/8 ounce because you're tournament bass fishing and you just want to do it with lighter tackle and lighter stuff.
Right.
In China and Southeast Asia, they really started going smaller. They're like, how small can we go? Like,
Right.
and they would catch everything from barramundi, you know what I mean? Like you see my arms out on either side of my body
Yeah,
right
that's crazy. Yeah.
to like
That's a
little river,
violent, explosive fish. This is not
exactly, to
a
aggressive little
subtle,
river
delicate
carp,
fish. Yeah.
mountain trout, and all kinds of cool species that they have over
Right.
there in East Asia.
Right.
So at that point, because the variety of fish are so much bigger, the variety of equipment became so much more, right? And
Right.
that really
Yeah.
started pushing that ultralight, like that, how light can we go side of the market? And that's
Right.
when it started catching on through the internet in the USA. And
Yep.
that's when I caught on to it, right?
Yep.
I wasn't there at the ground level back in, 2004, 5, 8, when I was
Sure.
a,
Sure.
I was a kid in high school and whatever at that point in time.
Right.
But
Right.
once it started catching globally, social media, China started making it more affordable, more viable to get that equipment. You had to wait, you had to order it from, random Chinese websites and wait months for it to get there. But you
Right.
could get it, and you can get it at not $500. You know what I mean?
Right.
Whereas in
Yeah.
Japan was really that super high-end market. And that's what kind of took off and got into the US and
Hmm.
into Europe and kind of like a bigger global market. Um, from there, this is where I maybe toot my own horn a little bit. I don't want to take too much credit for anything, but I want to say right after I got sent home from work due to COVID, so early 2020, maybe late 2019, right?
Hmm.
Um, Gary Dobbins of Dobbins Rods
Hmm.
posted on the Dobbins Facebook page that he was looking into building some lighter powered bass rods.
Hmm.
It was essentially where he was at with it, right?
Right.
And myself and a lot of other Dobbins fans, right, kind of hit him up and said, "Hey, do BFS, do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Right.
we want it. No one else knows
Right.
what it is, but we want it."
Right.
And he reached out to me and said, "Hey, I've never heard of this thing, but you seem very impassioned by it." Not only
Yeah.
myself, Trey Harple as well, is a big Dobbins guy. Maybe you know Trey, maybe not. He's
Know
a
the
name.
name. Don't know him
Yeah.
personally. Yeah.
So myself and Trey are the people that Mr. Dobbins reached out to and said, "Hey, you guys know this style of fishing. I'm going to send you these rod blanks we've been working on over at Dobbins. Tell me what to do with them to make it an actual bait finesse style rod." So he sent
Right.
those. That was 2019, early 2020. We played with him for 6 months. We fed him feedback. We do this with the guides, do this with the handle. Let's beef up the rod tip, this, that. I told him you have to put the lure weights in grams on there, which he did, and I was happy
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
And those released, and they released to market in mid to late 2020, and no one
They've done
from
very well. Yeah.
they had done very well now. There was a big fan reception. BFS guys all over the US were happy about it. The Dobbins guys were happy about it.
Right.
All the major tackle shops said they did not want them. They said there's no market for these things. No one's going to want these.
I
What is
haven't
this?
tried it yet.
There's no such, there's not even a reel in the US available for this kind of rod. And
Right.
so we were, essentially told no, or these are not going to sell in the US. So Dobbins was selling them on his website. And I said, "Hey, Gary, I think I can sell these for you." And really, kind of the rest is history, right? From there, I said, from there, I came up with the name, came up with the shop, and it took off. It wasn't about a year later, Shimano decided to release the Corrado BFS in the USA.
Hmm.
There
Hmm.
was Casking had a BFS reel released about a year before that, actually.
Yeah.
What was it called? The Zephyr BFS, which
Yeah. Zephyr and then the Kestrel and then they've had several. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, right. So it started trickling in slowly but surely, right around, like I said, in the US, right around 2019, 2020, first with Dobbins, then with Casting, then with Shimano, and then in the last two or
Hmm.
three years, I don't think there's a company out there that hasn't at least tried to
Yeah.
put the BFS name on something. I
Right.
wouldn't certainly they've always done a great job, but they've at least tried to print that name onto some piece of equipment to sell to people. You know what
Right.
I mean?
Yeah.
And that's really that's the story, I think, of
It's
a quick
fascinating.
summary of where it is today, how it got to where it is today. My small part and I think helping to bring it to market. Um,
Absolutely. It's very
yeah.
cool. So how would you, I mean, this is a subjective question. I'm asking you to guess, and I know that, and that's okay. But you think as we break it down, trout versus bass versus saltwater and other things, panfish, whatever, probably bass still the biggest market in the US.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
In the USA. Well, you know what? I don't know, man. I'd say a lot of it's like a lot of multi-species anglers like myself too,
Yeah.
right? Um, I, I, I'm a trout angler, I'm a bass angler,
Hmm.
but really I'm more of just an angler. Like I'll go to the lake and I might say like, hey, I want to catch bass today, so I'm going to bring these jigs. I'm going to bring these bass marketed crankbaits or whatever.
Right.
But at the end of the day, like I'm casting at everything, man. If I see a
Yeah.
pike, if I see a bluegill, if
Right.
I see a native suckerfish, like
Yeah.
if I can coax it into taking my lure, I am happy to catch it and then release it back into the water.
Absolutely. Yeah. And everything eats this stuff, right? Like
Absolutely.
I just keep being surprised. And it's, again, fish however you like. Fish casting, fish spinning, fish for the species you like, fish river, lake, pond, fish whatever you want. I like all of it, right? And
Hmm.
anything that makes it more fun to catch fish. It's like being a kid again almost. And is like fly fishing's not the easiest way to do it. In a lot of ways, BFS is probably not the easiest way to do it,
No,
right? But
no,
I
no.
find it
And I
very
get
gratifying, right? And it's and this concept of a tackle system, I think, makes you a better angler. Thinking about everything: the rod, the
yep.
reel, the line, the knots, the hooks, the split rings, the
I
lures,
get
the
newbie
presentation.
anglers kind of, dropping in online at the shop from time to time. And
Yeah,
I'm happy to point them to the gear that I think will work best for them. But at the
yeah,
end of the day, I really think this is I want to say an advanced technique. Maybe not uber level, like
mhm,
you don't have to be the world's best angler to fish it, obviously. But I think it's
yeah,
a beyond basics kind of thing, right? Like you
right,
are probably better off learning to use a bait caster on a medium heavy bass rod. Do that for a couple seasons. Get comfortable with a bait caster. Learn how it works. Learn how to control your thumb, control the spools. Because everything on
right,
this is just so much because you're dealing with smaller lines, smaller lures. Everything's more finicky, right?
yeah.
Little mistake on it may not be noticeable on your medium heavy rod with your 16-pound fluoro, but on your
It is
ultralight
on this.
4 pound, that
Yeah,
letting go that split second earlier makes a huge difference,
right.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
So it's not a scary advanced technique. It's not, anyone who can fish can master this. If you can fish a bait caster, you can master this
yeah,
fairly comfortably. But if you're brand new to fishing, get some time under your belt first. Learn your basics, learn how to catch the fish first, so that when you
yeah,
take your bait finesse stuff out there, you're not focusing on learning how to fish, you're focusing on learning the equipment,
yeah. That's
if that
great
makes sense.
advice.
So,
So let's talk a little bit about the rods, right? Because it is you mentioned that a lot of times people think of very short rods, and a lot of like close quarters, small stream BFS trout fishing, you do use shorter rods, but as you
and
said, the
so good
first
for that.
mainstream being
Yeah.
6'4", that's not a terribly short rod,
No.
right? So like talk to me about the rods and actions and sort of, because you fished so many of them, you've helped develop the Dobbins ones. Like if I was a rod builder and I came to you and said, hey, I'm kind of new to this thing, I'm kind of used to getting into it. A buddy asked me to build him a BFS rod, like uh, what sort of orient us to that and give us a little primer if you would.
Yeah, so BFS rods are as varied as the species and techniques you catch with them. All right. Whether you're throwing, skirted bass jigs, or you're throwing crappie jigs, right, which is just a ball head and a 2-inch bait, or
Right.
you're throwing a quarter-ounce crankbait that could dive 8 feet, or you're throwing a top water frog, whatever, right? You're
Right.
gonna need a rod that's versatile enough to tackle those techniques, or specific enough to where you can have specific rods for specific techniques, right?
Okay.
And then on top of that, you have the whole variety. The biggest factor, and one thing a lot of people ask me for, like, hey, this is the fish I want to catch, this is the lure I want to use. But a lot of people forget to mention what water they're fishing, right? Which I
Right.
think is
Yeah.
maybe the number one determining factor, maybe behind the lure itself, right?
Hmm.
The species probably falls later down that list of importance.
Okay.
But the water you're fishing, right? If you're fishing, I'm in Arizona, I fish a lot of
Right.
mountain streams, right?
Right. Yep.
Now I've seen people in the East Coast say, "Hey, I fish streams," and they show me a picture, and that looks like the biggest rivers we have in Arizona. But
Yeah.
really, like a
It's all
lot of this
relative. Yeah.
it is all relative, right? Some of these streams I fish, they're 3 feet across.
Right.
7
Yeah.
inches deep. You might find a pool that's 3 or 4 feet deep. Like that's a
Right.
pool.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
and the streams themselves are a foot deep, but 7 inches deep, whatever. So it's going to depend. You have to think about where are you fishing, right?
Yep.
And then think about what lure you want to use, right? And those go hand in hand. Where you're fishing, what lure you want to use. Those You're going to choose one based on the other, right? Once you
Right.
have that in mind, then you can choose the rod,
Mhm.
right? And then once you have the rod, you choose the line, and then you choose the reel. That's my order, anyways, of thinking,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Place, lure, rod, line, reel. Okay, so if you're fishing a mountain stream, and you're wading, you're knee deep, or you're in pine trees like I am a lot, and I have a tree, 3 feet on either side of me, I don't want a 6 foot rod. I don't want a 7 foot
Right.
rod, right? I know
Can't
like
work
a
with
lot.
it. Yeah.
Exactly. You need to be able to cast. You need to be able to underhand cast, sidearm cast, whatever. You need to be able to move that rod around.
Yep.
So that's the first thing you got to decide is like where you're going, right? If you're going for those smaller streams, you want a smaller rod. That doesn't always mean a whippier rod, though, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes the big trout in small streams, and if the water's really flowing, you need backbone, right? So we'll get into
Right.
power and taper later, but really, like lengthwise, you're looking at 5.5 to 4 foot for those trout streams,
Okay.
right? That's where I'm going with trout streams. That's the first one I'll
Okay.
mention.
Yep.
Bass fishing rods, right? You're fishing ponds, you're fishing on a lake, you're tournament fishing, whatever. There's a huge variety out there. I have rods everywhere from 5 foot up to 7.5 foot. But I think the sweet spot is going to go back to where Japan put it in the beginning. Between 6 and 6.6 is a
Okay.
very, very comfortable and good range for a versatile bait finesse bass fishing rod. The reason
Yep.
for that is because it's long enough to give you good casting, right? You're only going to cast small lures so far, right?
Right. Right.
Like you go to 7 foot, it's not going to be a huge difference versus a six
Yeah.
three or 6.4. It really isn't, right? Because you're
Yeah.
casting tiny things to begin
Such a
with.
lightweight. Yeah.
Exactly. So with something that 6 to 6 foot 6 range, you're going to get good distance. You're going to get good leverage. There's plenty of backbone down low, right?
Hmm.
You got plenty of backbone down on the bottom half of the rod to move a 5 pound bass, a 6 pound bass, a 10 pound bass with that rod. But you also, it's short enough to where you can do a lot of short, accurate pitching type
Hmm.
stuff, right? You have your
Hmm.
rod pointed down, you flip it up,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Right.
You want a shorter rod for that,
Yep.
and just a lot of top water, I like that shorter range. I think you
Yep.
know where I'm getting
Yep.
at with it, right? You want to be
Hmm.
able to point your rod
Absolutely.
down and
Tip of the
wiggle that
water.
tip
Right. Yeah.
around
Tip
and
down,
stuff.
work it. Right. Yeah.
And
Exactly.
if you're the guy that says, dude, I only drop shot, I want to drop shot, I want to do it on bait finesse gear, get yourself a 7 foot rod, point that rod tip nice and high,
Yeah.
sit
Yeah.
on the
You'll
your
be
boat
fine.
and wiggle it, right? You'll be
Right. Yeah.
fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you're going to be a versatile, aggressive, kind of
Right.
fast pace bait
Yeah.
finesse angler, which I think is where it really shines,
Hmm.
you're looking at that 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", 6'5", whatever, somewhere in that
Okay.
ballpark. Works really
Yep.
well for most average height American people like myself.
Sure. Yeah.
So, and then, you got, like I said, you can get into longer rods too for bass fishing. If you're doing
Hmm.
a lot of hair jigs, if you're doing drop shot, if you want to, whatever reason, you just want that extra 3 feet casting distance, go for a longer rod. The U.S.
Yeah.
market has made 7 foot rods, 7'4", 7'6" rods available,
Hmm.
right? That wasn't
Yeah.
wasn't really a thing before the U.S. market on the bass scene, but it's becoming a thing, and you can do it. I think there's disadvantages to it in that I
Hmm.
think that the shorter rods offer more precision, not only in casting, but I think in feel, right? The
Hmm.
longer a rod gets, especially a light powered rod, a little more
Get a little mushy and droopy.
wobble it
Yeah.
gets in that upper
Yeah.
end, right? And you lose some of that. Now there's rod building techniques to get around that, and we can talk about
Sure.
those when we
Sure.
get to them. But you
Yeah.
lose some of that precision, I think bait finesse is good at if you start getting
Yeah.
into longer rods on the bass side of things.
Yeah.
And then to throw it out there, it's not as big a scene, but saltwater. You mentioned it earlier with the red peppers. Man, I'm glad you mentioned that lure. I friggin' love them. They're so
Yeah.
fun.
Dude, it is.
Top water,
I
yeah.
Oof.
Saltwater,
That
top
lure
water.
under dock lights, like we have these underwater dock lights, and it's glass minnows, and fly anglers are often effective because they're throwing very minimalistic kind of flies that are mostly see-through. There's a couple of those colors in that red pepper that are translucent, kind of see-through.
Hmm.
Dude, lights out. I've got one I've probably already had to swap hooks on because getting hooks broken off like 3 or 4 times. I mean, they eat that bait. It
They
works.
do. They do.
Yeah. And everybody thinks I'm nuts. And whenever someone comes down and sees me, like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm bait finesse fishing." They're like, "Whatever, man." They
Yeah,
just
we
think I'm
carry
nuts.
two sizes of that, but there's even more in Japan, and I'll probably bring them over. And now that I know you're using them for saltwater, I'll bring this. They have saltwater specific ones.
Oh, do they?
I
Yeah.
think they come with the rust-proof hooks and the
Yeah.
saltwater
Yeah.
color.
Yeah.
You get
Yeah.
your awashi sardine colors, your clears,
Oh,
saltwater.
dude, talk to me,
Because the ones I
baby.
carry now are all the kind of the bass color schemes,
Yeah.
which work, but you can always specialize more.
I am catching mangrove snapper on them. And
Yeah,
anybody who is a guy, I was talking to a guy who's a buddy of mine down here, and he's like, "You're not catching them on lures." And I'm like, "I'm catching them on top waters, right?" And
yeah,
he's like, "I've not seen that." I'm like, "I swear, I promise I'll send you pictures." Again, they're not all giant, but
yeah.
just the fact that
But they
it's so
feel like it
telling
on
to me.
Bait Finesse, yeah.
I don't think I've ever caught a mangrove on anything other than live or cut bait, right? They're just a bait
Prior to that,
centric
yeah.
fish. They're very, very hard to fool. And so I'm left wondering, well, is it the size of the bait? Is that I'm downsizing to 4 pound line? Like I'm still
Could
trying
be.
to, but it works, man. And that's all I care about, right?
Yeah.
And so fun, right? Catching these, again, a fish that would on a a stout 7 foot medium heavy spinning rod with 20 pound braid and 15 pound leader would not be that fun to catch. You'd be like, oh, it's short, it's not legal, it's no fun. They'll pull drag, and
It's a
I mean
blast.
it's a blast, right? And you get so many more bites. It's just fascinating.
Mhm.
I'm literally on the heels of my sales and marketing guys are going with me. We're going to the White River in Arkansas, and the Norfolk River, which is a trout fishery I'm very familiar with. Have been fishing for like 45 years, literally. And this is the first time I've ever gone with bait finesse stuff, and I'm
No, it's
so
gonna be.
excited because I know we're gonna destroy them. I mean,
Yep.
I already know how well we're gonna do, and it's a remarkable fishery. So I can't wait. It's fun. Um, One of the things that I'm scattergunning a little bit right now, and I wanted to, this is a little bit selfish, but it's useful for our audience too. So, when we think about like what I'm doing fishing wise most of the time, right?
Hmm.
I'm typically running braid to a mono or fluoro leader, depending on what I'm doing. And then there are specific applications like a dedicated top water rod where I might want a mono because I
Hmm.
want the stretch and I want the line that floats, and then, there's some dedicated things where I'll use straight fluoro, where I don't want braid on that, where I'm using just fluoro. I'm not sure I've gotten my head around as a BFS neophyte yet. What would you advise me about when I use braid and with a leader, when I use straight fluoro, when I use straight mono? Like, talk me through kind of the use cases. And I know, again, use whatever you want, use whatever's effective, use what you can afford, whatever. But like, how do you think about the line system? We already talked about you don't fill these reels, right? Because
Yeah.
of the spool mass. But help me like crack the code on when to use braid, when to use mono, when to use fluoro.
Okay. So it's a matter of it's a system, right?
Okay.
Balancing it with your choice of lure, your choice of rod,
Okay.
all of the above. Now, I will say the overall market trend in the USA has been
Mm-hmm.
to use thin braid
Mm-hmm.
on everything, basically.
Right.
Thin braid,
Right.
thin braid, thin braid, right?
Right.
And I
Right.
could see the advantage to that. First of all, the suppleness of braid makes it the easiest line type to manage on a spool,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
It doesn't,
Right.
unless you're casting it too hard yourself, right? The
Right.
braid's not going to poof off of the spool like other
Right.
line types do. So there's a
Yeah.
huge advantage in that. The braid also gives you the versatility of being able to swap your leaders, whether that be, swapping for a mono or a fluoro leader or polyester if you want to get fancy and get into some of the
Right.
crazier line types, right?
Yep.
You can always run any of those as leaders, but you also have the advantage of being able to swap poundage, right? You can go from
Sure. Yep.
a 2 pound leader because you're throwing something super finesse, to the same rod and reel, change it to a 7, 8, 9 pound leader, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
right? So braid does have that advantage.
Okay.
It's what I would probably recommend for most beginner
Okay.
bait finesse anglers because it's just eliminating one more pain point that some people have, right? Which is other line types. It can be a pain point for some people.
Right.
Braid is what I
Backlashing and things. Yeah.
Yeah, I think braid is easier to pick the backlashes out of.
Right.
It's easier to not backlash.
Right.
Braid itself is thinner and lighter, so if you do
Yep.
want to fit more line, you can. I would still recommend sticking with 50 yards.
Manufacturer's recommendation. That's right. Yeah.
Exactly, right? It doesn't matter how
Yeah.
thin the line is at the end of the day, like I always feel it's going to perform better if you
Mm.
go less on a bait finesse reel.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, so braid has those advantages that I went over. I when I first really got into bait finesse, I used a lot of braid, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I still do use a lot of braid. I'm not going to say I don't, but I do think that braid also, I don't want to say it hinders you, but it doesn't necessarily always bring out the best attributes of your equipment,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
right? Braid has no stretch, right? Which
Right.
some people think is like one of the best things in the world about braid, but that could be a major disadvantage if you're
Yeah.
fighting feisty fish with thin lines and thin hooks and they're
Tiny hooks.
pulling and
Yeah.
they're jumping. And
Yep.
people also think braid is the most sensitive line type. and it is only under one condition, and that's when the line is taut.
Yeah.
As soon as you put slack in the line, braid is the least sensitive line type. All right.
Interesting. Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
loose piece of string,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
It
Right.
is. Whereas in mono, fluoro have some rigidity to it, right? If I
Yeah.
were to
Still
just
has
take a
some
piece of fluoro and set it on the
conductivity.
table,
Right.
touch one end, the other end's going to shake. That's not the case with braid,
Yep.
right?
Right.
So you have a lot more sensitivity with fluoro, especially if you have some slack in your line, right? When you're
Hmm.
going straight, tight line, braid obviously is always going to be the most sensitive. Always going to be. It's that thinness, it's that no stretch.
Right.
The attributes
Right.
of braid that people love. But when
I'd
you're
even go so far as to say if you're thinking about getting into this and you haven't done it yet, look up Amir and the guys at Bait Finesse Empire, get a rod, get a reel, spool it with braid, and put a leader on it and get you a micro jig head and a micro Ned plastic
Mhm.
and go out and throw it, and you will become a believer immediately.
Yeah,
That's all you
yeah.
got to do. You don't have to overthink it in the beginning. Like everything that swims eats that. It's crazy. But
You know. And then I like to use mono, especially with trout fishing in streams and creeks.
okay.
Uh, you have trout, in my opinion, are the feistiest of fish, right? In
Hmm.
terms of just pulling and jumping and making long runs, right? They don't
Right.
bulldog as much as like a bluegill or a bass would.
Right.
They're jumpers, right? They're jumpers and they're
Hmm.
runners, and so you want that stretch. I
Hmm.
feel like, especially when you're well, mainly when you're in a creek or river type situation where the water is moving, right?
Yeah.
You want the stretch that the mono gives you.
Okay.
If you're fishing for trout in a pond, a still water pond,
Hmm.
well, in Japan they call area style trout,
Hmm.
which is
Yeah.
stock trout in ponds, right? Which I do a
Right.
lot of that too here in Phoenix. I
Sure.
think you'd be better off with a probably braid to leader or a
Okay.
floor or a thin fluorocarbon.
Okay. These are really, really fine lines. And I should confess before I get started, I'm a knot junkie. I tie a lot of knots. I put them on the machine. I test them. I break them, destroy them, and I
Hmm.
learn what works and what
Hmm.
doesn't. And it's been so thoughts about the joins on these tiny little lines, right? So
Sure.
one of the things I've learned over time is the best braid to fluoro join for 20-pound fluoro to 20-pound leader is not necessarily the same as the best join for 80-pound braid to 200-pound fluoro, right? And it's interesting. And look, it just is. Certain knots do better in lighter and heavier applications. What do you like for knots when you are running braid to a mono or fluoro leader? I mean, we're talking about 0.6 braid. I mean, very fine braid going to 4-pound fluoro or mono. Let's just say,
Hmm.
what knot do you like for that connection?
Um, if you can do it, I will always say go with an FG,
Even in that tiny fine stuff.
even in
Okay.
that tiny fine stuff.
Okay.
The reason isn't necessarily the braking strength, right? We all know FG is having the best braking strength, or
Right.
so to say, anyways, of leader braid to leader knots.
Right.
Um, you're dealing with sometimes, not always, right? But a lot of times you're dealing with such fine line like a 4 pounder, a 3 pounder, a 2 pound. Like
Hmm.
braking strength is low no matter what.
Right, right. Yeah,
So, but what you are overcoming by using an FG is the fact that majority of bait finesse rods are going to use micro guides.
right. And you can pass that connection through
And
anything.
that and
Yeah.
that will pass through. Now that being said, I'm not the world's best FG tire, and I know most people aren't. And it's something that you probably like if you're going to tie up 2 or 3 rods, do it the night before and take those FG knots with you, right? But if you're on the
Yeah.
water and you need something that's quick and easy and works almost as good as an FG. I'd go with like an Albright,
Hmm.
or even a simplified like Alberto type thing. If you go into like a uni to uni type knot, then you're really going to be smashing those guides every time you try to cast the leader through, right? Unless you're running a short enough leader where you keep it outside the rod. But I think there's disadvantages to that in bait
Yeah,
finesse.
clearly.
Yeah.
How long a leader do you normally run? I mean, I know it varies by application and everything else, but
I
like,
try to do a rod length.
okay,
Right. You just got to think about what a leader is for, right? A leader's for one, putting some invisibility between the lure and the braid.
sure,
That's the
right,
first thing the leader is for. The second thing is, just creating that abrasion resistance that especially a fluoro leader gives you. And when you
right.
think about it in a fish running or whatever, it's probably going to be those first couple of feet that
Picky
if
abuse.
it gets around a
Yeah,
log or if it gets around a
right.
rock or whatever, that's probably where it's going to be rubbing.
Yeah.
So you want at
Those
least a
first
couple
few feet
feet.
closest to the lure or bait.
The
Yeah,
closest to
that's
the
right.
lure, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's so you want at least a few feet if your abrasion resistance is why you're
Hmm.
doing it.
Yeah.
If you're just going for the clarity, longer is better.
Yeah.
There's people that use straight braid too. I mean, some of these braids are so thin, and if you get like a white one or a blue one, it might, or even a
Yeah.
dark green, it might just
Yeah.
blend right in. But I think
Yeah.
you, at that point, you lose the advantage of the attributes of the leader, right? Which again
Yeah.
is that stretch and that forgiveness that your
Yeah.
thin hooks on these lures
Yeah.
is going to want.
Yeah, and this is not a knock on the quality of these braids. They're very, very good, but it's just the abrasion resistance is not much, right? To
So
your
one thing I
point.
like to say about Japanese line in general, but especially braid, right? If you're not a user of Japanese line, and when I say Japanese line, I mean line made for Japan, right? Every
Mhm.
Japanese company has American line. Some line has
Sure.
American line. Saiwa has them.
Right.
I mean, one's made specifically for Japan. They are true to what the box says, which is not
Right.
true of lines that are
Right.
sold for. So when it tells you
Yeah.
this breaks at 10 pounds,
That's in
it break
optimum conditions
that is
without use,
that is
nick,
the
or wear. Right.
absolute best case scenario. It will break at
Right.
10 pounds. That's like a brand
Yeah.
new line out of a box. You give it a pull, it hits 10 pounds, it's gonna break.
Right. Yeah.
Realistically, you're tying your knot, you're using this line over the course of a couple weeks, seasons, whatever, and you're going, you get where I'm going with it.
I do. Yeah. Absolutely.
So that's one thing
Absolutely.
to know about Japanese lines, right? So,
Yeah.
most of the time you're going to be used, like you said, a point six, a point eight, somewhere in that range, which
Yeah.
is a realistic breaking strength of 10 to maybe 15 pounds.
Hmm. Yeah.
And it's the equivalent of like maybe a 2 pound mono, right?
Yeah. It's
In
very
terms of
fine.
size,
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
not even smaller sometimes, right? Depending
Well,
on what.
here's where it's a good thing you're only putting 45 meters on because you can just doesn't take that much line to respool, right? When you
Yeah,
when you wear it
absolutely,
out
right?
and you need to switch it. Yeah.
You should be able to get two or three spoolings out of each package of
Yeah,
line.
one of these small spools. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. And I
Absolutely.
only carry the small spools in the shop because I don't see a need to have a 5 year supply of a single
Right.
braid. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
you buy one spool, it could literally last you a season. You respool two or three times if you're
Yeah. Yeah.
operating
And
it
that's
off.
not even if you don't swap it end to end and use the fresh end that was
Exactly.
towards the spool. And yeah, so there's
Exactly.
there's ways
Exactly.
to stretch the life of the line for sure.
So
Man, this is so fascinating to me. Well, let's talk about you guys and how people find you. So they can go to www.baitfinesseempire, right?
correct.
And I'm telling you, and I'm a online shopping junkie and a gear junkie and a tackle junkie, but I mean, Amir and the crew have literally the who's who of great lures from all kinds of brands. We mentioned the Timco, you got Jackal, you got Jackson, you've got even Leland's Lures, an American company that makes some great trout stuff. You've got oh, there's so many. The
I like to,
Smith, the Valkine or however you say it, Van
yeah,
Fluke,
Vulcan.
Veravas. You have a great selection of lines, probably the biggest selection of dedicated BFS reels and lures for sure. And they can find you at baitfinesseempire.com.
Correct.
They can also, contact you, and we'll post all this up with the description. But you can also submit a form through their website to get in touch with us, and they're very responsive. That's how I got in touch with Amir to get the podcast scheduled. Or you can email them at contact@baitfinesseempire.com. And again, we'll put all this in the description. But if you haven't tried it, and really we're scratching the surface. We may have to have you back to go into some more detailed techniques or to break it down a little more specifically for bass or specifically for trout, because there's a lot to learn, but it's not so complicated that if you know how to fish, you can't go out and do it. And
Absolutely.
it's been a long time since I've had this much fun fishing on this gear. And I can't tell you, a lot of us will have these memories of going to a particular pond or private piece of water or something where it was like, man, you're lit up. The fish get no pressure, and like every cast you catch a fish, right? That's kind of what bait finesse fishing feels like to me in the places I'm
It
doing
can
it
be.
because
It can be.
because it's just so effective because nobody's fishing this way, right? And you really don't need that much. A couple of rods and reels to me is always better than one, but they're accessible, and the number, thanks to shops like yours, the number of high quality rods, reels, lines, leaders, dedicated, uh, monos and fluoros that are optimized for this technique that we can get, or like they never have been before. Like literally 2 years ago, 3 years ago, before you opened the shop, some of this stuff you couldn't get in the States unless you went on eBay and bought it from a Japanese seller, or you were
Hmm.
lucky enough to travel abroad or whatever. You've now got this great selection. Buy a few top waters, buy a few hard baits, buy a few jigs, buy a few soft plastics. Just get out there and try it. It's just remarkably effective and such a fun way to fish.
Yeah, absolutely.
I literally could ask you 150 more questions. What are the most important other things I should have asked you that I haven't, that you want to make sure you leave with our audience in this first conversation?
Um, I mean, at the end of the day, you know, it's a tool, man. It's a rod, it's a reel that are designed to do a variety of things in a smaller weight class than your typical bait casting rods and reels, right?
Right. Yeah.
The amount of techniques, meaning like if you're a jigging guy, if you're a cranking guy, if you're a spinner,
Mhm.
the amount of techniques you could do with it is endless. The amount of species you can catch with it is endless to the extent that they don't overpower you, right?
Right. Yeah.
You're obviously not catching tuna with these
Yeah. I was
things,
gonna
but
say no
like you
yellowfin
said,
tuna on the.
yeah, but like you said, man, you're catching snappers. I've been down to
Yeah. Yeah.
Mexico. I've caught red snapper down there. I've caught
Yeah.
pompano, all kinds of cool,
Oh
20,
yeah.
24, 25-inch fish on it.
So
Um,
you have some guys that are kind of part of your team that run really great social media content for this stuff. So you're on all the socials as Bait Finesse Empire, but you've also got Jimmy, and Jimmy runs a YouTube channel called Raw Fishing. It's
raw fishing.
RA uppercase WR.
Yep.
Excellent, a lot of content, a lot of unboxing and overviews of reels and lures and techniques, and how light can you go with this particular reel and things. And he's a multi-species guy like you, fishes for all
Big
kinds of stuff.
multi-species guy. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you've got Hunter, the hunter fisher, right? He's a guy in Florida who does a little bit more of the stuff. But I've seen a few of these videos where Jimmy and Hunter are fishing on the beach, and it's like I never even thought of BFSing in the surf, dude. Like they're
Mhm.
catching flounder. I was like, I'm gonna get after that for sure.
Yeah.
That's kind of next on my list is
Yeah.
take the BFS gear to the beach.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a lot of fun. And once again, depending on what you're going for, when you're going out to the beach, take your 7 foot rods, your 7.5 foot rods, right? You can
Yeah,
make big casts. You may not be
right.
true surf fishing, right? Where the waves are pounding you, but you get into estuaries, you get into small rock piles, you're fishing near the pilings of the piers and stuff like that.
Yeah,
You catch all kinds of stuff on bait finesse and any kind of ultralight
yeah.
or light
I'm
or
taking
medium light setup.
I'm starting to get some pretty consistent shots at sheep's head. I haven't caught one on the
Nice.
BFS stuff yet. I've caught puffer fish on the BFS,
Oh
which was
yeah.
a surprise.
Man, those guys take chunks out of your lures every time.
Oh, yeah, they got that's some nasty teeth. You pull them,
Yeah,
you pull one up on the dock, and they puff up, and then you go to try
yep,
and unhook them, and you hear it going, "Snap, snap, snap, snap,"
yep,
and
yep.
they're not a joke, man. But it again, it just speaks to like I didn't even know I had those fish around my dock. I
Hmm.
never seen one, had no idea they were even there, and now we're catching them somewhat on the regular on this gear,
Yeah, and I
and we're
want to
not
say,
targeting them, but
if if you're not an angler who's necessarily interested in bait casting, or maybe you bait cast but you prefer to use spinning for the light stuff, still plenty of room for you in what we
yeah,
do, right?
100%, yeah,
There's no line or lure or hook or piece of terminal tackle that we offer at Bait Finesse Empire that you can't use on your spinning setups, right?
yeah, yeah.
At the end of the day, the rod and reel is just my personal preference.
Sure, sure. Yeah, no, it's a great point. And like you said, it's a tool, right? And like you said, fish whatever you want, right? But you can do some pretty impressive things with the dedicated gear optimized for this system and concept efficient. So, man,
Absolutely.
Amir, it has been so nice to meet you. We may have to do a part two and get into this some more because somehow I had these questions and I know there's we could pick your brain for hours and get
I
a wealth
know.
of
I
information.
tried to give you a warning at the beginning, man.
No,
Like,
this is a good
there's so
thing.
much.
This is
I
good.
feel like it's such a unknown, right? I think a lot of
Yeah,
what I hopefully, right, to some of your listeners at least, like it was educational, right? A lot of
oh,
what I
100%. You've demystified it a lot. You've given
a
us a
lot of what
place
I
to
went into, I
start.
think a lot of people don't know about. And I know we didn't get so much into the actual building of the rods. I do have some kind of formulas that maybe I'll email them to you. You could post them up when you
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah.
and I'd love,
Yeah.
if and when you have time another time, I'd love to show
Yeah,
you.
let's do another one. Absolutely. I'd love
I
to do
really,
that. Do
I
a
spent some time listening to a couple podcasts ago. You had, I forget the gentleman's name, but he really went into action and power, and he talked about the common sense system of rod
Oh, Tom Kirkman.
measuration.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There you go.
Hmm.
That's the gentleman. And
Yep.
something that really stuck out to me, which I'd always talked about, but never really heard it on from a pro, right? Like an
Hmm.
actual guy at his level, is a lot of these rods really are going to be kind of multi-taper, right? And
Yep.
multi-power rods.
Right.
You've got your tip action, and then you got what the backbone does, and that's it's going to be a little bit different sometimes. And so I'd love it, at some point let's go into some of that
I'd love
deeper
that.
level
I'd
stuff.
love that. You have my commitment. We're going to schedule a part two, and we're going to get into the actions. And you have a quiver of rods. This will be so cool. We can look at some different visually, look at some different lengths and powers and actions,
Absolutely.
and what works well for stuff you're doing. Well, Amir, thank you so much. It's so great to have you on, and we appreciate everybody listening and tuning in to the Mastering Rod Building podcast. So please like, subscribe, download wherever you get your podcast content, and we'll see you next time.